Well, it is an honor to be the moderator of this discussion on this very timely and important topic that is the future of food and agriculture. My name is Frances Coe. I'm a correspondent and producer for CGTN America, which is an international TV station based in Washington, D.C. I'm very honored to be part of this discussion with some real leaders in this field, and I would like to take the opportunity to introduce them now. First, we have Recht. She is the Vice President of Sustainability at Aleph Farms, an Israeli-based company that specializes in cultivated meat. Jason Clay, he's Senior Vice President for Markets at the World Wildlife Fund. And last but not least, Justin Kamine, he is the co-founder and CEO of Do Good Foods, which aims to fight food waste and combat climate change. Thank you so much, all of you, and welcome. I want to first start off with Lee, if I could. Last year, when I moderated this discussion on this very topic, the big headlines were COVID pandemic, as well as climate change. And unfortunately, we are still dealing with these issues and will be for some time. And now we have this added challenge of the Ukraine conflict. Can you talk about how these issues impact our food system, particularly because we're so intertwined internationally, and how do they show how vulnerable these systems are?
Sure, I hope I heard you correctly. Absolutely. I think what happened with COVID, and we're seeing this now with the conflict with Ukraine, and we're definitely going to be seeing more and more as we continue with these different climate events that are occurring already and will continue to occur, is that there is a lack of resiliency within our food systems. And that is something that we absolutely need to tackle as soon as possible. So when we're looking at, when we're thinking about kind of framing the context, we are looking about issues regarding climate loss, climate change and biodiversity loss. We're looking at issues about food insecurity, which is a major aspect. And we've seen this really with COVID, where we've seen an additional about 150 million additional people that suffer from hunger. And then, of course, we look at also the resiliency within supply chains and in general creating kind of resiliency throughout the food system. So I think in that aspect, the food systems and the companies within it really need to find these solutions in resolving these main three issues. And of course, we also have public health issues also when we're looking at different aspects of COVID and workers' well-being and so on. So I think that is something that really needs to be critical. And I think there's not one company or one approach that can help this. This needs to be a system-based approach. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to incorporate the farmers and the agriculture, the food industry and the policymakers, the consumers. I think consumers are really interested in being more responsible in their consumption, but I think they lack knowledge and education. I think we need to think about aspects of social equality as we're transitioning to more climate-friendly technologies and approaches. And of course, I think we all need to be a little bit more accountable of how we are building our food systems and thinking about issues of sustainability and ESG and maybe even economic, health, environment, social aspects, all in all. So, I mean, I'm happy to get into a little bit more. We have a very interesting white paper that we spoke about on how we believe the future of the meat sector kind of looks. And we put in the center, by the way, sustainable agriculture. We are big believers that as we want to transition our food systems, the center of it is transitioning from intensive agriculture to more sustainable practices of agriculture. We are focused specifically on livestock agriculture, but I think in general, that's something that we can talk about when we're looking at all different kinds of products. And then everything else should be supplementing the sustainable agriculture. So we're big believers in sustainable practices of agriculture. We're big believers in sustainable livestock agriculture. We believe that this is critical for the climate, for being capable of recycling different nutrients of water, of absorbing more carbon dioxide on one hand, but we also are very aware to the fact that there is potentially a gap that can be created from the capacity of sustainable agriculture versus the growing demand of food, the growing demand of meat, the growing population. And that's where we believe that technology can come and support innovation, can come, of course, cultivated meat as something that complements agriculture, not replace it for any means.
Yeah, it's a big issue with a lot of layers to it. Jason, if I could have your thoughts on this?
Well, I think in some ways we're in the middle of maybe the first of what may be many perfect storms. And I would say right now, though, it's characterized by the 3 C's. So it's COVID, climate, and conflict. And we really need to see that this is something that's likely to occur more. Just on the climate side, part of what has accentuated the impact of the invasion of Ukraine is the fact that 3 of the 8 countries that export most of the cereal grains and most of the oil seeds to the rest of the world during bad years had climate problems, and they had lower production. Canada is actually importing grain from the US. They're not exporting it. Brazil and Argentina had bad years. And then if you 2 other of those countries, those 8 countries, it's Ukraine and Russia. And they're a little bit preoccupied right now, from restrictions to all kinds of other reasons. So 5 of the 8 countries that normally fill in the gaps, they don't feed the world, but they fill in the gaps when there's shortages. And that's really important in our food system. Most countries are relatively self-sufficient. 70% or more, probably 75% or more of all food is consumed domestically. It's not imported from abroad. But trade is a big factor in how we fill the gaps. And the gaps always happen. What nobody's really talked about too much, which I think we need to prepare for, is when India and China have problems. And China's had a problem with wheat production this year. They're importing rice from India to actually feed animals. But as the saying goes, when China buys rice, the world trembles, because they're such a huge consumer that it just sends shockwaves through the world. Those 2 countries have avoided famine for a long time, decades, but that's not going to be the case going forward. They are going to be hit by climate change. It is going to affect production. So we've got to start anticipating these issues. And I think I would see the COVID part of this as being some lessons learned that we should apply as we go forward. One is that you can and you have to make decisions based on imperfect science when you have urgent situations. We did that with COVID. All the vaccinations were developed, with imperfect science. We also have to realize, and I think Lee said it, is that nobody's big enough to address these problems by themselves. We've got to work together, not just about COVID, but about climate. And then finally, the thing that I don't think anybody's really started to look at yet is, how did we build awareness? How did we build consensus during COVID? Every newspaper article, every news program, every blog told you every day how many infections there were, how many hospitalizations there were, what the death rate was. Data was used to actually create awareness and build consensus globally, not just in one city or one country, but all countries were monitoring other countries. We have got to start doing that with climate change. Where do you see data about the number of deaths caused by climate change? The amount of pre-harvest loss we have, I would call it kind of climate loss of food. We think it's at least in the 10 to 15% range already of food that is not produced, that used to be. So it's not post-harvest loss, it's not food waste, but it's actually happening before that. We need to understand these trends so that we can anticipate them. Because if we react to things, we're dead in the water. We have got to start anticipating things using imperfect data, building it as we go, and going from there.
I'm glad you mentioned that aspect, because we've talked about how so many players in this. The media is certainly one. Me being in the media, public awareness is a key part of this. Justin, if I could have your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think what Jason and Lee it's a tough act to follow. I think they hit a lot of things that I was going to talk about. But at the overall notion, resources are going down, population's going up, and there's a tremendous inefficiency in the middle. And whether it be food waste, whether it be our soil health, we got to look at creating closed loop systems at a large scale and supporting, to Lee's point, supporting all things in agriculture that are more regenerative, that are more sustainable, that are plant-based or cellular-based proteins. We need them all. At the end of the day, the magnitude of these systems are absolutely massive. And I think that's what a lot of consumers fail to recognize, that we need all of these incumbents to actually come together and actually to truly drive sustainability at scale and to do things in the next 4 to 5 years, not the next 20, 30, 40 years. These pledges of by 2050, I'm going to become something more is, quite frankly, we're all out of luck and we're all screwed by that time frame. So I look at how do we all work together? There is the imperfect nature of science. It's inherently where we are. But I think, I mean, take, for example, food waste. 40% of all the food that gets grown gets thrown away. If food waste was a country, it'd be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. We use 20% of our land to grow crops that we simply put into landfill where it creates methane gas. So there's a huge inefficiency just within our own system and just within that one aspect of that system, where if we can convert that into an animal feed, great. Now we can actually reduce our usage of corn and soy or into a fertilizer, improve our soil health. So I think there's going to be massive, large scale infrastructure solutions. Part of what we do as a company is part of that. But then to Lee's point, consumers care now. The last report that I saw was that 90% of consumers are raising their hand and saying, what can I do to fight and combat climate change? But don't tell me I necessarily have to change my habits. Yeah, a lot of people want to try plant-based proteins and get into that whole movement, or cellular-based proteins, and that's fantastic. And a lot of people also, a majority of people are still saying, hey, I just want to eat my animal proteins. Well, how do we use that as a flywheel to actually solve some of our biggest environmental problems? It's all here for us. And if we were to rewrite the book on big ag, we would all do things drastically different. And to Jason's point, there doesn't need to be this new scientific breakthrough. There needs to be a breakthrough of the current systems that we've just allowed to happen, where if we reevaluate them and put environment, nature, and consumers all aligned, we can actually really create the right ecosystems and the right utilization of resources that we know we absolutely have to get to. This is not a we hope to do this and we hope to solve this. We have to. Otherwise, what are we doing?
Yeah, there's a huge urgency around this. I want to talk about, we're talking about the problems. Let's talk about solutions. More positive note. One thing that's been in the headlines a lot is this concept of vertical farming. This idea of growing crops vertically, horizontally, and using space in a more efficient way, using a controlled environment to grow these types of crops. I wondered if you could address this and other improvements that you have seen in food production that you believe create a positive impact on the environment. If I could have you, Jason, start off the conversation.
So I think we need to be, as I said, anticipating things. And my biggest fear is that a lot of people in the food industry are waiting to get back to normal, and they're never going to get back to normal. And in fact, we don't want them to. We want to use this opportunity to transform the food systems. So I think vertical ag is one of those issues that we need to look at. The technology is not all there yet to make it environmentally better than producing in soil, but just like wind and solar, we need the investments in this to make the technology better. But my concern about, and we've been involved in developing a vertical ag project in St. Louis, Missouri, that I think will be the largest in the U.S. And it's being built in an inner city area. It's tapping into resources that are stranded assets. It's using water and heat from a thermal power plant, so that and it's using all kinds of infrastructure, et cetera. But I think that we've also missed an opportunity. And the point I want to stress here is that transformational food systems going forward need to address social issues. and they need to address employment and incomes and livelihoods, it's not just about increased productivity, reduction of waste, and increasing price. It's about making sure that farmers have adequate livelihoods, making sure that the people that you hire have adequate livelihoods, and maybe even have more assets. So in that vertical ag project, it would be great if we could reserve 25 or 30 or 40% of that equity in that plant to be owned by the workers in it, or to be owned by the communities that house it, so that it is firmly in that community. And then that business model we could take to every city in the US and do the same thing. And we'd have a different kind of food system where people are more engaged. We have to use this opportunity to be really, really good that way, to anticipate another project like this. We're looking at where the next California is going to be in the US food system. We know it's not going to be in California. We're not producing what we need from there. They're going to produce a lot of stuff. It's going to have value, but it's not going to provide the fruits and vegetables and nuts that California has to date. So where's the next one? What other country is doing that? Every country has a California in their food system, a place that provides them with most of their food. What are they doing to transition to the next one? We've got to anticipate these problems. And to Justin's area on food waste, there's a Dutch company that's just now expanding into the US market that produces eggs by feeding hens food waste. That's a whole different way to use food waste to produce food. And that's called Kipster, and it's an interesting company with an interesting profile. We need to look at these kind of new models and share the information, because we're all living on this planet together. So the faster all of us can learn, the better off we're all going to be. At a recent innovation and VC meeting in San Francisco, one of the things that was striking was that there was a lot less talk about intellectual property and a lot more about data sharing, because the data becomes obsolete so fast. The technology become obsolete so fast that people are seeing that they can learn more by sharing to solve the next problem rather than just hold on to the last.
Lee, if I could bring you in, what do you think about what was just said?
Well, I really relate to what Jason's speaking about the social aspect of, when we're incorporating innovation. This is something that we put a lot of focus on, because, cultivated meat is an emerging technology, an emerging industry, but it's not coming into some kind of vacuum. There is an actual very lively meat sector out there, and there's about 1.2 billion people that rely on their livelihood on the meat sector. So when we're looking and thinking about how we enter in the business models, we have to take the supply chain throughout the meat sector in consideration as we're building our business models. And that is something that I also want to say a lot. It is not usually, I don't think it only has to do with the technology. It also has to do with the approach, the business model itself, and how you want to work with it. And one of the things that, for example, we're doing, because this is something that's really close to our heart, the social aspect of kind of entering our market, is we're now conducting a research with the Federation University in Australia with a professor that's an economist and ecologist in the food system called Professor Sandhu. And basically what we're trying to do is we are exploring the different methods of livestock production in different regions in the world, and seeing how cultivated meat can enter the sector and provide value to all different stakeholders within that sector, with the emphasis on the farmers, with the cattle ranchers and the feed farmers. And we're doing that because we understand that this is something that we need to consider as we are looking at of creating a new food system. So it can't only be about just looking at the environmental aspect, which is critical, and by all means, I think it's something very important to think about regarding climate and biodiversity, but you really need to be holistic about it. You need to think about financial and economic aspects. You need to think about the governance about it. So these are, of course, you need to think about the social aspect. So I really relate to that, and I think that's very important. Aleph a lot. We work with 6 major meat processors, because we want to work within within the meat sector and support that transition to becoming more resilient. We want to leverage existing infrastructure, but we also want to support it and create it as something that can become more resilient. Aleph Farm is also, from early on, back in 2020, even prior to COVID, we committed to becoming net zero in our operations in 2025, which is really soon, in our operations and throughout our supply chain by 2030. We don't want to wait to build ourselves in a way that that is aligned to the current food system and then struggle with how do we reduce and how do we create that resiliency and circularity and all the different aspects later on. We want to build the company from inception in that way. And there's many struggles there as well, but we know that that's going to be the right way to do business. So I think that's, these are all aspects that you're thinking about when you're kind of looking at these new technologies, also looking at the impact of the product itself, but also looking about the accountability of a company as it builds itself.
Listen, I want to bring you in, talking about this issue of food production. What challenges do you see in food production? And what do you think is the best way to approach it?
Well, it's definitely an interesting time at this exact moment, as Jason, I think, mentioned, probably one of the most historic and unique, from logistics to supply chain to commodities to fertilizer to then climate, and resiliency. And I think everyone's looking around the table and saying, okay, how do we think through that this is not going to be just a one-off type of kind of time, that this could potentially be where the environment and where our future of food is going. And to Lee's point, we all need to come together to create the resiliency and the capability to continue to provide all of us as consumers products that we want 3 times a day. And just the reality of that. I'm actually an investor into a large indoor farm, Aero Farms, and they're doing great work and really expanding. I'm an investor on the board of Lollyware, which is a seaweed-based bioplastic, which is actually utilizing seaweed to actually then pelletize it and convert it into what looks and feels exactly like a single-use plastic. Once again, empowering consumers to just simply continue their habits. We're not going to change all these habits overnight, but empowering them to continue their habits and actually use that as a flywheel. If, for example, for seaweed, which is a carbon sink, it's a carbon negative sink, right? And it doesn't require any inputs. You can just keep growing it and sequester more CO2. So if you can build up a seaweed economy, all of a sudden you could utilize that to help solve some of the climate change issues. Same thing with what we're doing on food waste with Do Good Foods. We're converting, and as we're scaling, up to 160 tons of meats, fruits, and vegetables that we're collecting from supermarkets every single day into a nutriently consistent, pathogen-free dried animal feed product the very next day. And then using that, all of those resources, of course, after we picked up or after any human donations can occur, as that's the best usage of food. But then the next best usage of food, based upon the EPA food hierarchy, is to be converted into this animal feed. Well, no one's ever done so at a large scale infrastructure level that could work with the largest retailers, make it economically viable. We pick up that food for free and then convert it into a usable form, exactly what Lee's talking about, that can go right into the existing feed mill infrastructure of every major farmer across the country and empower all of us as part of this agricultural system to help solve it, this major problem. And what's so exciting is when we link that then back to the consumer with Do Good Chicken, we have the first USDA verified carbon equation where each Do Good chicken that's fed a component of our feed now actually saves 4 pounds of surplus grocery food and 3 pounds of greenhouse gases. And if it's priced right in line and tastes this real chicken, why wouldn't we now do good? And that enablement of the consumers to simply be a consumer, whether they want to buy a celery-based protein, plant-based protein, or a real piece of chicken, they now have the capability and the trust and the honesty that, hey, now this product is actually doing good in the world. And I actually feel proud that I'm actually contributing to a net positive, not a net negative. And that's this huge transition that we are embarking on, that we need more and more companies to become a part of. Yes, the incumbents are going to be play a role, but it's going to be a lot of the retailers and consumers that are really going to be able to showcase and validate that we care, that we can use our food system to solve environmental problems. Because at the end of the day, the consumers are there and they're wanting to figure this out, because climate change is real to everyone, whether it be the fires in Boulder, Colorado, or the oceans, or the droughts. We're here now, and this is whether we need to look, as Jason mentioned, at the detailed science, or you just got to look outside the window and say, this is not normal. And look at then my retail shelf with my prices going skyrocketing. There's a problem, and we need to figure it out together.
Mhm.
You know,
I'm glad
pick up
Yeah,
on that.
sorry. Go ahead.
At the last COP in Scotland, it was clear that a 1.5 degree future, if we want that, and nature can't happen without nature. But I think what never really was stated clearly is we won't have nature if we don't get where and how we produce food right. And so there is a role for the food sector to really be quite positive in this. But I think more than that, there's a responsibility for them. And they need to step up on both of these issues. So some of the examples you're hearing about are really good ways to do that. And we need to share that information, get it out there, get more people pursuing these paths so we can all learn faster. We don't need 20,000 learning curves. You know, a couple dozen would be enough.
Mm-hmm. All of you have touched on this idea of public awareness. I recently did a story about upcycling, and I spoke with a representative with the Upcycling Food Association. And one of the things he mentioned is this obstacle of, you know, getting people more aware about what's going on, the concept of upcycling and all these other issues we've talked about. So I wonder what you think is the best approach to, besides the media putting these things out there. How do you approach having people understand what these concepts mean and how much difference they can make? How do you approach that? Let me start with
Me?
Lee.
Okay. I would say, you know, I'm thinking about public awareness, but I actually think it really starts with policy and with collaborations between public and private collaborations. I think that is critical. And then from there on, I truly believe, and then we can start already also increasing awareness within the consumers. When we're looking at system-based changes, we're looking at transformational innovation changes. This is really critical, inclusive solutions. We can't do this as a single consumer, a single food system, a single investor, a single farmer. We need frameworks that incorporate also incentives, incorporates regulation that really supports helping us understand how to navigate between the anxiety of everything that's happening. You spoke about the 3 C's, about conflict, COVID, climate. This is where we are, where we've become this population that lives in anxiety. And to that extent, to a certain level, I feel like it almost freezes us from allowing us to move forward. And what I think here needs to happen is really have policy members come in and say, we need to make systemic changes. We need to work together. Then we can also discuss how we educate consumers. For example, Denmark just last week or earlier this week legalized eco-labeling as a mandatory aspect in their food systems. This is something that has been spoken about for quite a bit. And already, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the European Union kind of said we would not be able to adopt it at this point. But we actually believe that eco-labeling is critical because it's part of that knowledge that you want for decision-making for consumers. And it doesn't necessarily need to be only about greenhouse gases, which carbon is critical by all means, but biodiversity is important as well. Social aspects is critical as well. Water, land, all of these have important things, but we also need to be very careful that we're not overloading these consumers with tremendous amount of knowledge that they don't know how to work around with. So I think these frameworks are critical. And I also believe that public and private collaborations can also really support these different emerging technologies that can support transition to more regenerative or sustainable agriculture, to programs for educating for more responsible consumption, thinking about how to work with more local communities, as Jason was talking about before, how we work with local food culture and local communities and really create that resiliency. Because yes, economies of scales and globalization has given advantages when all you're looking at is productivity and cost. But now that we already clearly understand that you need to incorporate externalities like environmental impact and public health impact, these are already things that are changing completely the way we approach building a supply chain. And I think these are things that really the food systems, the consumers really need, the farmers need the support of these kind of frameworks. So that's something that I would really kind of love to support moving forward.
Justin, what do you think about what Lise said about this idea of collaboration and policy? How do you approach it, do you think?
Yeah, so I think it all plays into one. I am one that, so we've built about $4 billion of infrastructure as a family over the past kind of 30 years in a bunch of different industries, in energy, then telecom, now then renewables, and now food waste and sustainable infrastructure. A lot of that has been helped by some policy, but what we kind of really look at and say is, well, we need to be economically viable with or without policy. And if we can go to the biggest corporations and to get them to showcase that first and foremost, it's economically viable, followed by then, oh my God, it's amazingly sustainable, then that's really the big unlock that I think is key and critical and necessary for, at the end of the day, how do you scale these solutions as quick as possible? And that's all I care about. We all know and we all have the solutions at hand. We're not looking to solve this problem with a massive technological breakthrough or some amazingly new technology that's created by a chemist. There's not gonna be that aha moment where we unlock the world's capabilities. We literally have it all in our knowledge and understanding, and literally with products and companies that actually have the solutions now. Now it's all about how do you take these companies that are all relatively small in the grand scheme of things and just get them to scale as quick as possible. And that all comes back to, okay, great, everyone's inherently driven by money. If you can make it an economic decision, then all of a sudden you can scale it in that much quicker and that much greater of a way. So can policy be help there? Yeah, absolutely. Do I have trust and faith that policy is going to really be able to drive that and really be able to be innovative and really be able to be incentivizing enough in that capacity at a timely manner that's not in the next 30, 40 years? I would bet against it. But that's just not that's my non-political dynamic. So I keep looking back to the way that we solve environmental problems, because it's the food system, because it's the energy system, because it's the transportation system, it's the shipping, it's the clothing, it's everything. It's all centered around capitalism. And if we can showcase we can be economically viable and amazingly sustainable, well, I think that's the best business. And when you talk about sustainability, it's sustainability and profitability, and it's sustainability within the environment.
I'm based in Washington, so I know how glacial policy change can be. So I've seen that firsthand. I want to bring in Jason. What do you think is the best approach to increasing public awareness on these issues?
Well, so I actually want to answer the previous question, and I think in doing so, we'll also contribute some insight on that as well. But I, in my work, what I've discovered over the years, looking at many different commodities produced in many different parts of the world, is that from an efficiency point of view, the bottom 25% of producers produce about 50% of the impacts, but only about 10% of the product. So if we want to increase total production and reduce impacts, we focus on working with the bottom, either make them better or get them transitioned into something else. And I think regulation is essential for that, because I don't think any major buyer of commodities targets the poorest performers to buy from. It's not in their nature. They in fact pride themselves that they buy from the better producers. These aren't their problem, etc. But in this same capitalist system that created all the innovation, we also have a lot of others that are hanging on by their teeth and causing a lot of the problems that we need to work on. Regulation is one way to get them out. Information and new ideas is another way for the ones that want to grow out of it. But I think we could do something slightly different. I spent many years, decades, in fact, setting up certification and standards, and what is better, how do you define it, what does it look like, all seafood and forest products. But I think that we also need to be thinking about, is there a minimum set of requirements that any food produced and exported should meet? I think we need to be considering something that's parallel to Codex Alimentarius, which looks at health and safety regulations and makes sure that you're not going to get sick eating something that's been imported. Why don't we have a Codex Planetarius to make sure that globally traded food doesn't degrade the environment? Why would we want to use trade to degrade the environment? Now, what a country does domestically is going to be up to them, but can we use trade to start creating an escalator? Well, even just build consensus. These are the 5 or 6 biggest impacts. This is how you measure them. This is what the escalator looks like to go from poor to better to better to better to best in class. We need those kinds of metrics, those kinds of consensus. And I do think there's a role for regulation in this, both in terms of the trade, and this could be WTO friendly. It's not inconceivable to see that could happen. Anyway, I think that those are the kinds of things that would complement the innovation and the known but not necessarily scaled solutions that we have right now.
You guys are all forefront of these issues. What are we, Jason, you touched on some of this, but what are we not talking about that we should be talking about? And what challenges do you see that we'll be having to discuss soon in the coming years, and perhaps even beyond that time period? Lee, can you address that?
Yeah, sure. I think one topic that's not being talked about is the true cost of food. I think it's being talked a little bit about, but I don't think it's really being incorporated. There's always been issues of how you can translate what an externality is. There's many methodologies, but I think that's something that's critical. We see there are specific foods that are being heavily subsidized where other foods are not. And I think that we need to kind of look at that and really understand how we measure the true cost of food, and we have to incorporate these kinds of externalities. I think another thing that's really critical is standardizing methodologies for impact. I think it's really difficult that we're working. I mean, I, as a sustainability officer at a young company, and trying to navigate of how to create a really resilient and sustainable food system, and struggling with the different methods that are out there and kind of seeing how we can work around it. And in many cases, I see that we're positioning ourselves as the leaders and as the case study for this kind of future because it doesn't exist yet. So I think for me, the two things that need to be really discussed are true cost of food and standardizations of methods to support us. There are already today, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a standard for measurements. We need to do that with all different kinds of indicators, environmental, health, climate, and so on, and start really standardizing and working together as a global presence.
Thank you, Lee, for mentioning the cost of food, because we have talked about this topic a lot, but I don't think the public really truly understands why eggs cost $4, a dozen or what have you, because they don't quite understand how the food system works. And so that is an important point to make. Jason, if you want to address that, what do you think has not been addressed that we need to address?
I think the fact that 3/4 of the world's poverty, 3/4 of the world's malnutrition, 3/4 of the world's stunting is in farming communities, both small farmers and also laborers. Nobody's talking about that. That is a huge issue. I think we haven't talked about how comparative advantage has led us down a path where countries are using income generated in certain sectors to buy food. And we saw the impact of that in North Africa and the Middle East, where the price of bread, which was went up phenomenally, created huge food riots, etc. Well, the price of food prior to the invasion of Ukraine was already higher than it was in 2008 to 2011, and it's gone up considerably since then. So any country that is dependent on 50% of its food being imported is in deep trouble. And we need to really start anticipating that, because we're going to start seeing migration coming out of that that's not anticipated, especially if the price of oil and natural gas eventually moves away. Some of those regions are going to be really in difficult shape. I think we got to pivot government subsidies from what we don't want to what we need for the future. We don't want to keep repeating or perpetuating the current system. So how do we use that money to change the system? And then nobody's mentioned it today, but we have projected a loss of primary production around the planet. And a lot of people think about that as the health of soils, but it's also forest and oceans, and it's other things. If we have a loss of primary productivity 10 to 15%, that means that we're going to have to swim twice as hard to be treading water, much less to produce more surpluses. And so we need to take these things seriously and really begin to calculate, are the solutions fit for purpose? Are they going to give us what we need over time? Are we thinking big enough?
Justin, what are your thoughts? What are not making headlines? What do we need to be addressing that is not being discussed?
Well, it's difficult going third with these other panelists, as both Lee and Jason brought up amazing topics, and quite frankly, the ones that I was going to bring up. I guess I will go to a slightly different topic. I agree with everything that was just said. And then the last dynamic is convenience, and the fact that we as consumers, I mean, why is there so much food waste from retailers, right? It's because we as consumers can walk in, at least throughout the US, into any supermarket at any time throughout the year. We expect that we can see and buy everything. There is no seasonality. There is no even understanding of that anymore. 1 in 5 people in America, is one stat that I saw, have actually even seen a cow, right? And yet, so this disconnect between the farms, which makes sense. A lot of people live around metropolitan areas, and a lot of these farms are kind of in the middle of nowhere, where the disconnect between our food system is real for consumers. So everything that Jason and Lee kind of just brought up, people are understanding it. People are seeing the documentaries come out, recognizing what the current food system's doing, recognizing how the environment is being impacted, where people are becoming more educated there. But I think there's a big uphill battle in all of that still needs to occur. So more education is critical. And unfortunately, to I think Jason's point, I think the reality that we will start to just see a lot of this happen immediately is going to start to occur. And hopefully that then sparks all of us to really figure out the right scalable solutions immediately, because I think they're all here. It's just a matter of the will of some big corporations and some kind of unique entrepreneurs to figure all that out together. But I mean, you take some solace in companies like a Tesla or others that have actually truly innovated throughout the industry. Then you've seen that trickle effect across a lot of different kind of car manufacturers, of them all joining in on the electric. And we can get into that whole conversation later. But how do we implement that into plant-based and cellular-based and regenerative agriculture and solving food waste and using cover crops for our soil? Talk about subsidies, right? Well, if we stop subsidizing it, then maybe those farmers are actually incentivized now to actually use regen, which sequesters CO2, makes them more resilient, improves our soil health, and the consumers are willing to be a part of that because they want that regen farm corn and soy to go into their animal feed. It makes all the sense in the world. We just now need to implement it.
I think we're down to our last minute, so I'm going to put you guys on the spot and have you really condense your answers here. But what's your last parting message for Joe Public out there? And he says, well, these are just huge issues. These are so complex. How do we even tackle this? And what can I do as Joe Public to make a difference? What would you say to him? Lee?
It's a hard question because I feel in my approach, I feel like there's so much to do. Just make sure you're doing something. You know what I mean? I feel like there are many activities and many ways that we can approach it as a consumer, as a food system, as a farmer. But as long as we are moving forward, that is important. I do think that we need to be critical about where we are today. We need to know that we need to make big changes, but just don't kind of freeze. You know, Jason was talking about this, that a lot of these food systems are kind of waiting for it to come back. No, we're not going back anymore. We have to move forward. So that would say is my key message.
Jason?
I think that the population, the income and the consumption have to equal the resource base or be less than that, and they aren't today. They exceed it. So we've got to find out how to manage the planet in a way that maintains the planet going forward. We can't leave it to states or cities or counties or even continents to do this, because we are managing a global commons now, whether we realize it or not. And we're not doing a good job of it.
And final word from
I guess I'll leave it on a positive that we can solve this. I look at even COVID and the resiliency of nature across, whether it be Venice canals or whatever, the pollution. Nature has an amazing way to heal itself very, very quickly. And it's up to all of us to figure out how do we all come together now and recognize what we are in together. That, to Jason's point, this is a commons, and we cannot let this be the tragedy of the commons.
It really has been an enlightening conversation. I've learned a lot from all of you, and I applaud everything you have done in this field. You guys are really at the forefront of these topics, and hopefully this conversation will help with this public awareness issue that we've talked about throughout this conversation. Lee Recht with Aleph Farms, Jason Clay with the World Wildlife Fund, and Justin Kamine with Do Good Foods. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation.